They're not real grandchildren, Margaret. I wish you'd stop pretending. My mother-in-law's voice cut through the cheerful chaos of the family reunion like a knife. The backyard suddenly went quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy enough to touch. I stood there, fruit salad halfway to the picnic table, watching my children's faces fall as they processed their grandmother's words. My name is Margaret Chin, and at 35, I thought I finally found my place in the Sullivan family. My husband James and I had adopted our twins, Lily and Lucas, 5 years ago when they were just 3. They were our miracle, our answer to years of fertility struggles and heartbreak. But to Victoria Sullivan, they were a stain on her precious family tree. Mom, James started, but Victoria held up her hand, her perfectly manicured nails glinting in the summer sun. I'm only saying what everyone's thinking, she continued, smoothing her expensive linen dress. The Sullivan family has a noble heritage. These children, while lovely, don't carry our blood. They don't even look like us. I set down the fruit salad, my hand surprisingly steady. Around us, cousins pretended to be absorbed in their phones. Aunts suddenly needed to check on dishes in the kitchen, and my father-in-law Robert became intensely interested in adjusting the umbrella over the picnic table. Grandma, Lucas said, his small voice wavering, we made you a card. He held out the handmade creation they'd spent hours on, covered in glitter and carefully drawn family portraits. Victoria barely glanced at it. That's nice, dear. Why don't you and your sister go play? She turned to James. Honestly, if you and Margaret had just tried harder for natural children. That's enough. My voice was quiet but firm. Years of taking Victoria's subtle jabs, her passive-aggressive comments about adoption, her exclusion of my children from family photos. It all crystallized into this moment. I reached for my bag, pulling out my laptop. Since you're so interested in our noble heritage, Victoria, I have something to show you. I've been working on a little project. Margaret, James whispered, touching my arm. He knew that tone in my voice. It was the same one I used when I discovered one of my students cheating in my history class. It's okay, honey, I said, opening my laptop. Your mother's right. Heritage is important. That's why I've spent the last 6 months researching the Sullivan family tree. Victoria's expression shifted slightly. We already know our history. The Sullivans came over on the Mayflower. Actually, I interrupted, turning the screen so everyone could see. That's not quite accurate. I found some fascinating documents in the county archives. The family began to gather around, curiosity overtaking their discomfort. I pulled up the scanned documents I discovered during my research. The first Sullivan in this area wasn't a Mayflower passenger. He was James of Sullivan, who arrived in 1892. And here's something interesting. I clicked to the next image. He was adopted. Victoria's face went pale. That's impossible. The records are quite clear. James of Sullivan was adopted by Michael and Mary Burke when he was 4 years old. They changed his name to Sullivan after the adoption. I smiled, clicking through more documents. And that's not all. Your grandmother, Eleanor Sullivan, she was adopted too. The backyard erupted in whispers. Victoria's sister Catherine leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Is that why we could never find Grand's birth certificate? Exactly, I said. She was adopted in 1925. I found the paperwork in the state archives. It seems adoption runs deep in the Sullivan family tree. Victoria sank into a nearby chair, her perfect posture crumbling. You're making this up. I can assure you I'm not. As a history teacher, I know the importance of thorough research. Would you like to see Eleanor's adoption records? Or perhaps the letters I found from your great-grandmother describing how blessed she felt to adopt James of Sullivan? Lily and Lucas had crept closer, their eyes wide as they absorbed this information. James stood behind me, his hand warm on my shoulder. But our heritage, Victoria stammered, is beautiful, I finished for her. It's a heritage of love, of choosing family, of making room in your heart for children who need a home. Just like James of Sullivan's parents did. Just like Eleanor's parents did. Just like James and I did with Lily and Lucas. The twins beamed, standing a little taller. Around us, family members were pulling out phones, taking pictures of the documents, discussing their own memories of Eleanor and the stories they'd heard growing up. Mom, James said softly, did you know about any of this? Victoria shook her head, still staring at the laptop screen. Your father never, we always just assumed. You know what they say about assumptions, I said, closing my laptop. They make you miss the truth about your own family. Now, who wants fruit salad? As I moved to pick up the bowl, Catherine grabbed my arm. Wait, Margaret. Tell us more. What else did you find? For the next hour, I shared the story of the Sullivan family, the real story. How James O'Sullivan had been orphaned in the Irish potato famine. How the Burkes had taken him in. How their love had given him a future. How Eleanor's adoption had saved her from a life in an overcrowded orphanage. How she'd grown up to become a champion for children's causes. Victoria sat silently through it all, the carefully constructed narrative of her family's noble bloodline crumbling with each revelation. Finally, as I finished showing the last document, Lucas approached her cautiously. Grandma, he said, still holding his card, does this mean you were wrong about us not being real family? The backyard went quiet again, all eyes on Victoria. She looked at the card, then at Lucas's hopeful face, then at the laptop with its undeniable evidence of her family's adoptive heritage. She began, then stopped, looking lost for perhaps the first time in her perfectly controlled life. The card is beautiful, I said, giving Lucas a gentle push toward her. Why don't you show Grandma what you drew? Lucas hesitated, then held out the card again. This time, Victoria took it, opening it with trembling hands. Inside, Lily and Lucas had drawn the entire family, including Victoria in a bright purple dress, her favorite color, though she'd never admit it, standing in front of what they labeled the best family ever. We gave you a crown, Lily said, pointing, because you're the queen of the family. Victoria touched the glittery crown they'd drawn on her head, and I saw something crack in her carefully maintained facade. A tear rolled down her cheek, leaving a trail through her perfect makeup. The story wasn't over. One afternoon couldn't erase years of prejudice and hurt. But as I watched Victoria pull both twins into a tentative hug, I knew something had shifted. Sometimes the truth, especially about family, has a way of breaking down the walls we build around our hearts. Margaret, Catherine called from the picnic table. You have to tell us more. When did you start this research? How did you find all this? I smiled, joining the family at the table. Well, it all started when I was teaching my students about genealogy. The weeks following the family reunion brought changes I never expected. Victoria, who had previously limited her interaction with our family to formal holiday visits and the occasional reluctant dinner, started calling regularly. At first, it was just short conversations, ostensibly about the family history I'd uncovered. I found some old photographs in the attic, she said during one call. There's one of Eleanor, my grandmother. She's standing with her adoptive parents. I never knew, I always thought. I could hear the struggle in her voice, decades of pride warring with newfound truth. Would you like to come over and look at them together? I offered. The twins would love to help organize them. There was a pause, then a soft, yes, I think I'd like that. That Saturday, Victoria arrived at our house clutching 3 dusty photo albums and a box of loose photographs. She was wearing jeans, something I'd never seen before, and her usual perfectly coiffed hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. I couldn't sleep last night, she admitted as we settled at the dining room table. I kept thinking about what you said, about choosing family. I found this letter. She pulled out a yellowed envelope with trembling hands. Lily and Lucas bounded into the room, excited to play detective with old family photos. To my surprise, Victoria didn't flinch or pull away when they crowded close to her chair. Is that you, Grandma? Lucas pointed to a faded photograph of a young girl in a formal dress. No, sweetheart, Victoria said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. That's your great-great-grandmother, Eleanor. And these, she pointed to the couple standing behind the girl, are the parents who chose her. Like how Mom and Dad chose us? Lily asked, her eyes wide. Victoria's hand shook as she touched the photograph. Yes, exactly like that. As we sorted through the photographs, Victoria began to share stories she'd heard growing up. Stories she dismissed or reinterpreted to fit her narrative of the Sullivan family's noble bloodline. Now, with the truth laid bare, these stories took on new meaning. Eleanor never talked about being adopted, Victoria said, showing us a wedding photograph. But she was always taking in strays, children, animals, anyone who needed help. I used to think it was beneath our family's dignity. She looked at the twins, who were carefully organizing photos by date. I was wrong about so many things. James came home from work to find us all on the floor, surrounded by photographs and eating pizza. Another first for Victoria, who usually insisted on proper meals at proper tables. "Mom," he said, clearly shocked by the scene. Victoria looked up, a piece of pepperoni pizza in her hand, and Lily leaning against her shoulder. "James, dear, did you know your great-great-grandfather was rescued from an orphanage by a baker and his wife? There's a whole letter here about how they saw him on their way to church and couldn't bear to leave him behind." That evening, as Victoria prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Margaret, I owe you an apology. Many apologies, actually. I've been so focused on maintaining this image of our family that I couldn't see what family really means." I watched as she knelt down to hug the twins goodbye. A real hug, not the stiff, formal embraces she'd given before. "Perhaps," she said, standing up, "we could make this a regular thing. I have more boxes in the attic, and I'd love the children's help sorting through them." "We'd like that," I said, and meant it. As her car pulled away, James wrapped his arm around my waist. "I've never seen her like this," he said wonderingly. "What did you do to my mother?" I leaned against him, watching the twins wave goodbye. "I didn't do anything. I just showed her the truth about where she came from. Sometimes knowing your real history helps you understand who you are now." That night, as I tucked the twins into bed, Lily asked, "Mom, is Grandma going to be different now?" I smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "I think Grandma is learning that different isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it takes a while for people to understand that families come in all shapes and sizes." "Like our family?" Lucas asked sleepily. "Exactly like our family," I answered, turning out the light. As I closed their door, I heard Victoria's words from the reunion echoing in my head. "They're not real grandchildren." How far we'd come in just a few weeks, from that harsh judgment to sharing pizza on the floor, surrounded by evidence that the Sullivan family had always been built on love rather than blood. But the biggest changes were still to come. 3 months after the reunion, Victoria called with an unexpected request. "I want to host Thanksgiving this year," she announced. "Not just for our immediate family, for everyone." "Everyone?" I asked, surprised. "Yes," she said firmly. "And I'd like your help with something special." That's how I found myself standing in Victoria's pristine living room on a crisp November morning, helping her transform the space into what she called a family history museum. We hung enlarged photographs of the Sullivan adoptions through the generations, each one telling a story of chosen family and love. The formal dining room, usually reserved for her crystal and fine china, now housed tables covered with old letters, documents, and family artifacts. But the centerpiece was something that made my heart catch when I first saw it: a massive family tree painted on canvas, with golden branches extending in all directions. "I hired an artist," Victoria explained, adjusting the lighting. "Look closely at the leaves. Each leaf contained a photograph, not just of blood relatives, but of every person who had ever been welcomed into the Sullivan family through marriage, adoption, or love." Near the bottom, in fresh paint, were Lily and Lucas's smiling faces. "It's not finished," Victoria said softly. "I left room for future additions. Family keeps growing after all." When the guests began arriving for Thanksgiving, they were greeted by this visual testament to the Sullivan family's true heritage. Victoria had invited everyone: distant cousins, family friends, even Eleanor's old neighbors who had stories to share. "Welcome to the Sullivan Family Heritage Celebration," Victoria announced once everyone had arrived. She was wearing a casual sweater instead of her usual formal attire, and her smile reached her eyes. "Today, we're not just celebrating Thanksgiving. We're celebrating every person who has chosen to be part of our family, and everyone our family has chosen in return." The twins, who had been vibrating with excitement all morning, led tours of the makeshift museum. They knew every story by heart now, thanks to countless afternoons spent with Victoria exploring family history. "This is James O'Sullivan," Lucas told a group of cousins, pointing to an old photograph. "He was adopted just like us, and he became a baker like his new dad. And this is great-great-grandma Eleanor," Lily added proudly. "She started a children's home because she knew what it was like to need a family." I watched Victoria throughout the day, seeing how she beamed every time someone discovered a new connection or shared a forgotten story. The formal woman who had once been so concerned with bloodlines and noble heritage had been replaced by someone who understood that family was something you built, not something you were born into. During dinner, Victoria clinked her glass for attention. I have an announcement, she said, standing. I've been doing some thinking about Eleanor's legacy. She paused, looking around the table at all the faces, blood relatives, and chosen family alike. I've decided to establish the Sullivan Family Foundation. We'll provide support for families going through the adoption process, helping them give children the same gift of family that James O'Sullivan and Eleanor received. The room erupted in applause. James squeezed my hand under the table, and I saw tears in his eyes. Margaret, Victoria continued, turning to me, I'd like you to help me run it. Your research skills and your heart for family, they're exactly what this foundation needs. I felt tears welling up in my own eyes. I'd be honored, I managed to say. And she added with a smile, I thought we could start by helping the Martinez family down the street. They're trying to adopt their foster children, and I hear they could use some support. Later that evening, as the gathering was winding down, I found Victoria sitting in her study, looking at the family tree. You know, she said without turning around, I spent so many years trying to prove we were special because of our bloodline. I never realized we were special because of this. She gestured to the photographs. Because generation after generation, our family chose love over everything else. She turned to me then, her eyes bright. Thank you, Margaret, for not giving up on me, for showing you what family really means. I hugged her, this woman who had once made me feel so unwelcome, and who now felt truly like a mother-in-law, like family. Grandma, Lily called from the doorway. Uncle Pete is telling the story of the Sullivan family circus performers. Come listen. Victoria laughed, a real, joyful laugh. Did I tell you I found more documents about that? Apparently, Eleanor's adopted parents met in the circus. As I watched her hurry off with Lily, I thought about how far we'd come. The woman who had once declared my children weren't real grandchildren was now their most enthusiastic champion, their keeper of family stories, their beloved grandmother in every way that mattered. James found me still standing in the study. Happy? He asked, wrapping his arms around me. Very, I replied, leaning into him. Your mother asked me earlier if I'd help her organize an adoption support group at her country club. He chuckled. From not real grandchildren to adoption advocate, who would have thought? Sometimes, I said, watching through the doorway as Victoria sat with the twins, showing them old circus photos. The best family stories are the ones that surprise us the most.